What she said next made a billionaire forget how to speak. The glass chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors as quiet conversations floated through the air, the kind of low, confident voices that came from people who never checked their bank accounts before ordering. And in the middle of it all, Clara Hayes moved like she didn't belong to the noise. Her black uniform simple, her steps measured, her presence almost invisible unless you were paying attention, which most people weren't. Because people like her weren't meant to be noticed. Not in a place like this. Not among tailored suits and watches that cost more than a year's rent. And yet there was something about the way she carried a tray, steady, precise, like she understood the room better than the people who owned it. Something that made a few guests glance twice without knowing why. But then the front doors opened and everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the air to tighten, for conversations to dip half a tone, for the staff to straighten their posture without being told. Because Ethan Cole had walked in, and power didn't need an announcement. It arrived quietly and expected the world to adjust, which it always did, his presence cutting through the room like a decision already made, his suit dark, his watch catching just enough light to remind anyone looking that time, for him, was never wasted, and as he moved toward his table, people noticed without staring, the way they always did with men who built empires and never apologized for it. And Clara noticed too, not with awe, not with curiosity, just a brief glance that lasted less than a second before she turned back to her work, as if he were just another guest. And maybe that was the first thing that bothered him, though he wouldn't realize it yet, because men like Ethan Cole were used to recognition, used to the subtle shift in energy when they entered a room, used to being the center without asking for it. And when the host led him to table 12, the best table in the restaurant, he sat without a word, already scanning the space like it belonged to him. And then his eyes landed on her again, not because she stood out, but because she didn't react, and something about that felt wrong, like a detail that didn't fit the pattern he understood. And when she approached the table, not hurried, not hesitant, just calm, holding a glass of water with both hands as she set it down in front of him with quiet precision, he didn't look up at first, because he didn't have to, because in his world, people waited for him to acknowledge them. But Clara didn't wait. She simply stood there, still, present, her posture straight, her expression neutral, and after a moment that stretched just long enough to be noticed, he finally glanced up, expecting the usual, the polite smile, the slight tension, the subtle eagerness to please. But instead he found eyes that didn't flinch, didn't drop, didn't challenge either, just observed. And something in his expression shifted. Not irritation yet, not curiosity either, just a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, and for the first time that evening, the rhythm of the room didn't follow him. It paused, just slightly, like a breath held between two words, and neither of them knew it yet. But that pause was where everything was about to change. Clara did not move when he looked at her, and that was the second thing that unsettled him, because stillness, real stillness, was rare in rooms like this. Everything here moved with purpose, with ambition, with the quiet urgency of people chasing something. But she stood there like she already had everything she needed, and Ethan Cole noticed, even if he did not yet understand why it bothered him. So he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her now, not as a person, but as a problem to solve, because that was what he did. He identified patterns, he tested them, he broke them, and when something did not behave the way it should, he pushed harder until it did, or until it revealed what it was hiding. And Clara Hayes, in her simple black uniform and steady gaze, was not behaving the way she should. "You are new," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with quiet authority, the kind that expected answers without resistance. But Clara did not rush to respond. She did not apologize for the pause. She simply met his gaze for a fraction of a second before speaking. "No, sir. I have been here for 3 years," her voice soft, even, without hesitation, and that answer, simple as it was, did not satisfy him, because it did not explain what he was seeing. So he nodded once, slowly, then picked up the menu without really looking at it. "Then you should know how this works," he continued, flipping a page with deliberate care. "I do not like delays, I do not like mistakes, and I definitely do not like attitude." The word lingered slightly longer than the others. Not raised, not sharp, just placed there like a weight, and around them, the subtle hum of the restaurant continued. But a few nearby tables had begun to notice, the way people always did when tone shifted, when something just beneath the surface started to tighten, and Clara, standing beside the table, did not react the way most would. She did not nod quickly, did not offer reassurance, did not shrink. She simply said, "Understood," and nothing more, and that was the third thing. Because there was no effort in her voice to please him, no adjustment, no calculation, just acknowledgement. Clean and complete. And Ethan felt something flicker again, this time closer to irritation, because control was not just about what people said, it was about how they said it, the small signals that confirmed they knew their place, and Clara was not giving him those signals. So he decided to push, just a little, just enough to see where the line was. "Bring me the ribeye," he said, closing the menu. "Medium rare, but not what you think medium rare is. I want it exactly 130 degrees, not a degree more, not a degree less. And if it is wrong, even slightly, I send it back." He placed the menu down with quiet precision, then looked up at her again, watching closely now, waiting for the shift, the tension, the subtle crack in composure, because everyone had one. Everyone eventually showed it. But Clara only nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Yes, sir," she said, writing it down with the same steady motion. And for a brief second, their eyes met again, and there it was, not defiance, not submission, something else, something that did not fit into the categories he understood. And as she turned to leave, moving with that same quiet efficiency, Ethan felt it clearly this time. Not curiosity, not yet respect, but something far more uncomfortable, the beginning of losing control over a situation he had not even realized he was in. The kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, but Clara Hayes did not rush through them like the others. She moved with the same measured pace, placing the order with quiet precision, repeating the exact temperature without emphasis, as if it were the most ordinary request in the world. And the chef, a man who had spent 20 years in high-end kitchens, paused for just a second longer than usual before nodding, because even he could hear the difference in how she said it. Not anxious, not apologetic, just exact, and that exactness lingered as she stepped back onto the floor, where the atmosphere had shifted in ways most would not notice, but everyone could feel, because Ethan Cole had not looked away from where she disappeared, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, his mind no longer on the menu, not on his phone, not on the deal he had been reviewing minutes earlier, but on her, or more precisely, on what did not make sense about her. And when the water glass in front of him reached half empty, he did not signal, he simply waited, watching, testing whether she would anticipate, whether she would miss it, whether she would react the way every other server eventually did under pressure, and almost as if she had heard the thought rather than seen the glass. Clara returned, silent, refilling it without a word, her movements smooth, uninterrupted, and for a brief moment, their reflections met in the surface of the water, distorted but aligned. And Ethan noticed something he had not expected. There was no tension in her hands, no rush in her breath, nothing that suggested she felt the weight of his attention, and that absence of pressure began to feel like pressure itself, subtle, quiet, but persistent. So he decided to push again, not with volume, not yet, but with detail. "Tell me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What does 130 degrees look like to you?" And the question was not really about the stake. It was about control, about forcing her to define herself within his terms. And Clara did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she chose the moment, lifting her gaze just enough to meet his, not challenging, not yielding. "It looks like consistency," she said softly, and then she added, "and discipline." And that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just two words placed between them like something complete. And Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her again, because that answer had not been wrong, but it had not been what he expected either. It had not been submissive. It had not been defensive. It had been precise, and precision without permission was something he was not used to encountering, especially not here, especially not from someone in her position and around them. The room continued its quiet performance, glasses clinking, low laughter rising and falling. But at table 12, the air had grown tighter, more focused, like the center of something forming. And when the plate finally arrived, carried by another server who set it down with careful hands before stepping away quickly. Clara remained, her attention steady as Ethan picked up his knife, cutting into the steak with practiced ease, checking the center, the color, the temperature. And for a moment, there was nothing, no reaction, no comment, just the quiet sound of the blade against porcelain. And then he took a bite, chewing slowly, deliberately, as if measuring more than taste. And when he finally looked up at her again, there was a flicker of something new in his eyes, something sharper. Because the steak was perfect, exactly 130 degrees, not a degree more, not a degree less. And instead of satisfaction, what he felt was something closer to challenge. Because perfection removed excuses, and without excuses, the only thing left to test was her. He set the knife down with quiet precision, not because he was finished, but because he had decided something. And decisions, for Ethan Cole, always came before action, never after, his gaze lifting from the plate to Clara again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if recalibrating what he was looking at, because perfection was not supposed to come from someone like her, not here, not without effort showing somewhere. But she stood exactly the same, posture straight, expression neutral, hands relaxed at her sides, and that consistency, that unbroken line of composure, began to feel less like professionalism and more like control, just not his. Interesting, he said finally, his tone light, almost casual, but there was an edge beneath it now. Something sharper, something searching, and a few tables nearby had gone quieter, not enough to be obvious, just enough that the space around them felt more defined, like a stage without anyone announcing it. Most people struggle with details like that. He continued, leaning back slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again, especially under pressure. And the word hung there, heavier than the others, because it was not just a statement, it was an invitation, or maybe a test. And Clara did not step into it the way he expected. She did not explain, did not defend, did not take the opportunity to prove herself further. She simply said, "Details matter." Her voice even, almost quiet enough to disappear into the room, except it did not, because the silence around them made every word land harder, and Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in focus, because she was not playing the role he had already written for her, and that meant he needed to rewrite the scene. "Do they?" he replied, this time letting a faint smile touch the corner of his mouth, the kind that looked polite from a distance but carried something colder up close. "Then let us test that." And without breaking eye contact, he reached for his glass, lifting it just enough before setting it back down with a soft, controlled sound. Not careless, not accidental, just enough to tilt the balance. A thin line of water slipping over the edge and spreading across the white tablecloth, slow, deliberate. And for a brief second, the movement caught the light, a quiet disruption in an otherwise perfect setting, and a few nearby guests noticed, their conversations pausing mid-sentence, forks hovering just slightly above plates. Because moments like this, subtle but intentional, had a way of pulling attention without asking for it. And Ethan did not look at the spill. He kept his eyes on Clara, watching closely now, waiting for the shift, the apology, the rush to fix what he had created, because this was the part where people revealed themselves, where composure cracked under inconvenience, where roles reasserted themselves clearly. And Clara looked down at the tablecloth for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register what had happened, then back up at him. And there was no flicker of panic, no tightening of her jaw, no quick movement to grab a napkin, just that same steady presence, unchanged. And in that stillness, something else entered the space between them, something quieter than tension but heavier than silence. And for the first time that evening, Ethan felt it clearly, not control, not irritation, but resistance, not loud, not obvious, just immovable, like pushing against something that did not push back, and somehow, that made it stronger. For a moment, nothing moved, not the water slowly spreading across the pristine white cloth, not the guests who had half turned their heads, not even the faint clink of silverware from distant tables seemed to reach this space anymore, because everything had narrowed down to a single expectation, a simple, predictable outcome that had played out 1,000 times before in rooms like this. The waitress would apologize, she would rush, she would fix what had been disrupted, and the balance would return exactly where it belonged. But Clara Hayes did not move. She did not reach for a napkin. She did not bend forward. She did not even glance around for assistance. Instead, she looked at the spill once more, briefly, as if acknowledging it existed, and then her attention returned to Ethan, calm, steady, unchanged, and that was when the shift became undeniable, because the script had broken, and when scripts break, people notice. A man at the next table lowered his glass slightly. A woman paused mid-sentence. The room did not fall silent, but it leaned in, subtle, collective, waiting, and Ethan felt it too, that invisible weight of attention, and something in him sharpened, because this was no longer just a test. It had become a moment, and moments required control. So he straightened slightly in his chair, his voice no longer low enough to stay private. "Are you going to just stand there?" he said, not loud, but clear enough that the words carried beyond the table, and a few heads turned fully now, the kind of attention that could not be ignored. And still, Clara did not rush. She reached for a folded cloth from her apron, her movement unhurried, precise, and instead of immediately wiping the table, she placed the cloth gently beside the spill, not on it, beside it, as if marking the boundary rather than erasing it. And then she spoke, her voice soft but perfectly audible in the space that had formed around them. "It will spread faster if I rush," she said, and the sentence hung there, simple, almost practical, but something about it landed differently, because it was not just about the water, and Ethan's eyes fixed on her, a flicker of something passing through them, recognition, not of her, but of the structure of what she had said, because it mirrored something he understood, something from boardrooms and negotiations and decisions made under pressure, and for a brief second, the edges of his control blurred, not enough to show, not enough for anyone else to name, but enough for him to feel, and that feeling did not sit well. So he leaned forward slightly, his tone tightening just a fraction. "Then do it properly," he replied, and there it was again, the attempt to reassert, to bring the moment back into a familiar frame. But Clara did not respond immediately. She picked up the cloth slowly now, pressing it lightly against the edge of the spill, absorbing it in measured movements, not rushing, not overcorrecting, just steady. And as she worked, she said nothing more, and somehow, that silence carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not resist him, it did not submit either, it simply existed. And when she finished, the tablecloth was clean again, the surface restored, the disruption gone. But the atmosphere had not returned to what it was before. Something had shifted, quietly, but permanently, and as Clara straightened, placing the cloth back into her apron with the same calm precision, Ethan realized something he had not expected. The test had not revealed her weakness. It had revealed his inability to control the outcome, and in a room where he controlled everything, that was the one result he had never prepared for. The table was clean again, the glass upright, the surface restored so perfectly that anyone arriving late would never know something had been disturbed. But the room had not reset, not completely, because moments like that did not disappear. They lingered in the air, invisible but present, carried in the way conversations resumed just a fraction slower, in the way glances returned more often than before, and Ethan Cole felt it, not as embarrassment, not as loss, but as something far less familiar, uncertainty, quiet and controlled, but there, sitting just beneath his usual clarity, and he did not like that. So he reached for his fork again, cutting another piece of steak with deliberate precision, as if returning to routine could anchor the moment back into something predictable. But even that felt different now, the rhythm slightly off, the control less absolute, and across from him, Clara Hayes remained exactly as she had been, present but not imposing, attentive without hovering. Her gaze no longer fixed on him, but aware of the table, the space, the flow of the room, as if she operated on a level that did not require constant attention to maintain. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him, because control, in his world, required focus, required effort, required presence. But she seemed to hold something steady without any visible strain, and after a moment, he set the fork down again, this time not as a gesture, but because the question had formed and would not leave. "You are very calm," he said, his voice quieter now, not carrying across the room the way it had before. but still clear enough to define the space between them, and Clara looked at him, not immediately, but with that same measured timing, as if she chose when to enter a moment rather than reacting to it. "I try to be," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer did not satisfy him, because it did not explain the absence of pressure he had been searching for. So he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to show intent. "No," he said, "that is not trying." And for the first time since he had arrived, there was no edge of performance in his tone, no subtle display of authority, just direct observation, and that shift, small as it was, changed something in the air again, because now the question was no longer a test. It was real, and Clara recognized it, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with understanding. And she held his gaze for a fraction longer than before, not challenging, not yielding, just steady. And when she spoke, her voice was still soft, but there was something beneath it now, something grounded. "Calm is not something you try," she said. "It is something you keep." And the sentence settled between them, quiet, complete, and Ethan felt it the same way he had felt the earlier shift, not as confrontation, but as something that redefined the frame he had been operating in, because keeping something required ownership, not performance. And for a brief second, the room seemed to fall away again, the low conversations fading into the background, the clink of glasses distant, as if the space had narrowed once more to just this exchange. And he realized, not suddenly, but gradually, that every attempt he had made to define her had failed, every test had returned something he had not anticipated. And that realization did not come with frustration, not yet, but with something quieter, something more unsettling, respect beginning to form in a place where control used to sit. And across from him, Clara did not wait for a response. She simply gave a small nod, not submissive, not dismissive, just acknowledging the end of a moment, and stepped back slightly from the table, not retreating, just creating space, as if she understood something he was only beginning to see, that the most powerful shift in the room had already happened, and it did not need to be repeated. Clara stepped away from the table with the same quiet control, her presence fading back into the rhythm of the restaurant, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the space she left behind did not return to normal, not for Ethan, because something had shifted inside the structure he relied on, something subtle but undeniable. And as he sat there, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, he realized he was no longer observing her as a variable to test, but as something he could not easily define. And that realization lingered longer than he expected, stretching into the silence that followed her absence, until it was interrupted by movement at the edge of his awareness, the manager approaching with careful steps, posture slightly lowered, voice prepared to smooth whatever tension might still exist. "Mr. Cole, I hope everything is satisfactory," he said with practiced politeness, and Ethan glanced up, the question landing differently than it would have 10 minutes ago. Because satisfaction was no longer the point, control had been, and control was no longer entirely his. So he gave a small nod, not dismissive, not engaged, just enough to acknowledge the presence. "It is fine," he replied, and the manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, sensing something unspoken, before stepping back, leaving the table once more, and Ethan's gaze drifted across the room, not aimlessly, but searching now, not for flaws, but for her. And when he found Clara again, she was at another table, listening to an elderly couple with the same steady attention, her posture unchanged, her tone soft, her movements precise. And there it was again, that consistency, that quiet command of herself that did not shift depending on who stood in front of her. And for the first time, Ethan understood something he had missed before. She was not adjusting to him because she did not need to. And that realization settled deeper than any challenge had, because it removed the foundation of the game he had been playing. And without that game, there was nothing to win, nothing to dominate, nothing to prove, only something to understand. And that was unfamiliar territory, so unfamiliar that it made him pause, his usual instinct to act replaced by something slower, something more deliberate. And when Clara returned to his table, not because she had been called, but because the timing was right, he looked at her differently, not as an obstacle, not as a test, but as someone who had already made a choice he had yet to fully grasp. "You knew," he said, his voice quieter than before, carrying none of the earlier edge. and Clara met his gaze with the same calm steadiness. About what? She asked, and he exhaled slowly, the words forming more carefully now. That I was trying to push you, he said, and for a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to recede again, not because it had disappeared, but because the focus had shifted inward, and Clara did not respond immediately, not because she was searching for an answer, but because she understood the weight of the moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as soft as before, but clearer somehow, more defined. People usually are, she said, and there was no accusation in it, no judgment, just a simple acknowledgement of something she had already accepted, and that was when Ethan felt it fully, not as a loss, not as defeat, but as something far more rare, perspective, quiet and undeniable. And for the first time that evening, he did not reach for control, he did not push further, he simply sat there, looking at her, understanding that whatever he had been trying to prove no longer mattered, because she had never been part of the game to begin with. The words settled between them without resistance, without echo, just present, like something that had always been true but had never needed to be said out loud. And Ethan Cole felt the weight of it not in the room, not in the eyes of the people who had long since returned to their conversations, but in the quiet shift of his own thoughts, because for the first time that evening, there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to test, only something left to understand, and that realization did not come with discomfort the way he might have expected. It came with clarity, slow and steady, like a line coming into focus after being blurred for too long. And Clara Hayes stood in front of him exactly as she had from the beginning, unchanged, not elevated, not diminished, simply consistent. And that consistency, he now understood, was not something she created in response to him. It was something she carried with her, something that existed long before he walked into the room, and would remain long after he left, and that was what made it different, what made it unshakable. And for a brief moment, Ethan looked down at the table, at the clean surface where the water had once spread, and he saw it differently now, not as a disruption that had been corrected, but as a moment that had revealed something he had not been looking for. And when he looked back up at her, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but enough that the sharp edges had softened, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. Most people react, he said, his voice steady, no longer carrying the need to control the outcome. You do not. And Clara listened, not interrupting, not filling the space, allowing the thought to complete itself, and when she responded, her voice was as calm as before, but there was a slight warmth now, not emotional, just present. Reacting is easy, she said. It is what happens when you give something control over you. And the sentence landed differently than the others, not because it was louder, but because it reached deeper, touching something Ethan recognized. Not as an idea, but as a pattern, something he had seen in negotiations, in boardrooms, in people who lost more than they realized because they could not hold still long enough to see clearly. And for a moment, he said nothing, not because he did not have words, but because the ones he had did not feel necessary. And that silence, unlike before, was not tension, it was space, intentional and complete. And Clara seemed to understand that as well, because she did not wait for him to respond. She simply gave a small nod, acknowledging the moment without claiming it, and stepped back slightly, creating distance not as an escape, but as a boundary. And as she turned to continue her work, moving back into the quiet rhythm of the room, Ethan remained where he was, watching her for just a second longer before looking away, not because he had lost interest, but because he no longer needed to hold on to the moment to understand it. And in that simple shift, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, the kind of change that did not announce itself, but altered everything that came after. The check arrived without ceremony, placed gently at the edge of the table, not slid forward, not announced, just there, as if it had always belonged in that exact position. And Ethan Cole looked at it for a moment before opening it, not with urgency, not with habit, but with the same measured attention that had begun to replace his earlier instincts. The numbers inside clear, precise, expected. And yet nothing about this moment felt routine anymore, because the evening had shifted in ways that could not be calculated. And as he reached for his card, he paused, his fingers resting lightly against the leather folder, his gaze lifting once more across the room, not searching this time, but observing. And there she was again, Clara Hayes, moving between tables with the same quiet presence, her rhythm unchanged, her posture steady, her attention given equally to every guest. And that was when he understood the final piece. It had never been about him, not the test, not the tension, not the moment that had drawn the room inward. She had not adjusted, had not reacted, had not even resisted. She had simply remained who she was, and in doing so, she had forced everything else to adjust around her, including him. And that realization did not come with resistance now. It came with acceptance, quiet and complete. So he signed the check without looking down again, placing the card back into the folder with a subtle motion. And when Clara returned to the table, not because she needed to, but because it was part of the rhythm she maintained, he looked at her, not as a challenge, not as a question, but as someone he now saw clearly for the first time. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried something different now. Not politeness, not obligation, but recognition. And Clara met his gaze with that same calm steadiness, giving a small nod in return. "You are welcome," she replied, her voice unchanged, because for her, nothing had needed to change, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. The space between them quiet, not heavy, not tense, just complete. And then Ethan stood, adjusting his jacket with a smooth motion, his posture still confident, still composed, but no longer carrying the same need to dominate the room. And as he walked toward the exit, the restaurant resumed around him, conversations rising, glasses clinking, the subtle hum of normalcy returning fully. But something remained, not in the room, but in him, a shift that would not announce itself in meetings or decisions, but would exist in the pauses between them, in the moments where control would once have taken over without question. And as the doors closed behind him, the night air cool against the quiet of the street, he realized something that had never occurred to him before. Power was not in how loudly you could command a room, but in how little you needed to. And inside, Clara Hayes picked up another tray, her movements as steady as ever, her presence as quiet as before, because she had not changed anything. She had simply revealed it, and in doing so, she had left behind something no one in that room would forget. Not the raised voice, not the tension, but the silence that followed, the kind of silence that does not come from fear, but from understanding, and it lingered long after the moment had passed, shaping everything that came after without ever needing to be spoken again.